to what it might look like and what it is either outside of the university system or what the impact that it might have on employment, particularly in the case of an organization like Udacity. One of the most exciting projects that I'm aware of in higher education credentialing is changing higher education, but it's doing so in the framework of higher education, which means that it's not a startup working off to the side. It's actually the university itself attempting to innovate on itself. And that's one of the aspects that I find most interesting about it. Great opportunity here to introduce Allyn to give us an overview of how this thinking is developed around how credentialing may work in the future of education.
Thank you. Check. I know it's working today. Check. There we go. Check. Wait on by the other people's equipment. Good. Yes, sir. Wasn't a southern versus northern hemisphere problem? No? Okay, we're good. Well, George, thank you very much for the introduction. I do hope people find the discussion today interesting, and I'm open to questions. I'll try and get through a few things, and then hopefully we can make this a little bit more interactive, because it's awfully boring if I just talk at you the whole time. So look forward to some participation a bit later on. So I've titled it Challenges to Higher Education, Open, Free and the Emergence of Credentials. I want to make a clear distinction between the work that's going on in what's often called the digital badging activity and what we're doing with credentials. They are somewhat similar, but there are also some key differences. Badges are often more informal. Credentials are something that we've taken through a very formalised process to ensure that we have validity, authenticity, that the dimensions of it are real, and that we can actually translate that into other parts of the model that we see in a much bigger vision, which relates to the way people manage their careers, transitions through the basis of credentialing. And at the same time, we've aligned these to not only what happens in the higher education side of things, but what happens in the employment, employability and career side of things. So something of a challenge, but we think we've made some reasonable progress. As George mentioned, Deakin Digital is it's actually a wholly owned subsidiary of Deakin University. Deakin University is somewhat recognised for its moves into digital models within higher education, to its innovation in that area, and also because it's very strongly focused from the university perspective into employability. There is a risk that what we're doing in Deakin Digital might actually disrupt in some form what's happening in the university itself. If that does happen, we don't think that's a bad thing. We think that's part of the natural transition that we probably need to make at this particular point in time. So what I'm going to do in this discussion is draw out a few threads about why this is an important thing for us to do, and then that also will give you an idea of understanding the perspective that we're taking, and then I'll try and wrap that up in some very short statements around what Deakin Digital is and what we're doing. I'm aligning this very much to the things that the Link Lab is designed to do. So we're focused on answering some of these questions ourselves, but in slightly different ways. Deakin Digital, not having the higher education strict focus, is doing it from a where the rubber hits the road kind of view of it. And we're finding some very different things emerging from that. So where are we today? If we normally ask that question, we start to consider, has the role of universities changed over time? What should it be doing now compared to what it has been doing? We look at what's been happening over the last 800 years maybe. Well, what if we shorten that timescale to even say what's different that's been happening even over the last 50 years compared to where we are now? And I think that in many ways there are lots of things that haven't changed. We need to remember that there's a lot of things that actually shouldn't change too quickly, because there's a whole range of rigour and robustness that occurs within the higher education environment that should not be lost. At the same time, we need to juxtapose that with the other sorts of things that are impacting against it and try and understand where shift needs to occur. Operating with that in mind from outside of the university space directly, we're able to challenge it in some slightly different ways. And the university is very interested in that and looking at what it can learn from the approaches that we take. We know, however, that the world itself has changed substantially along the way. Now, I'm sorry, in the transitioning between different formats of doing slides, I have lost the reference to this one. I did try and find it quickly, but I can't. I think I know where it comes from, but I couldn't find it quickly, so apologies for that. But this is the general overview of what's going on in the space, given the fact of what has occurred with ICT in general. And fundamentally what we've done is, rather than looking at this from an educational technology focus or looking from some other kind of focus that's like that, I prefer to look at it from the focus that what we've really done is we've changed the way people communicate. And when we apply that within educational context, we're actually doing that for a specific purpose, but it's essentially the communication and the channels and the opportunities that have changed, and that's the more significant thing. And those are the things that we need to bring into the fold of what we're doing. That's not to say a lot of that hasn't occurred, but I think in the broader scope of things, the changes that have occurred around universities as a result of these things have not been reflected yet with the same vigour inside universities. And that's probably the cusp of change that we're sitting on at the moment. So what is the scope of change? Everything else that the change has actually been fundamental. The way we access information and knowledge, the way that the business operates and transacts has meaningfully changed. And some businesses have, traditional businesses, which have been very large, have failed as a result. And so the impact has been quite severe. This change in the way that people communicate, access information, conduct their transactions is really, really important to look at when we look at, should we actually be changing what is really a fundamental industrial age view of how education occurs. One of the key things that's often mentioned in this space is the idea of affordability. Is it worth doing a degree? We see these discussions occurring on a daily basis. And so it's worth delving a little bit into what that means for us. Ernst & Young in Australia did a report which was University of the Future, and it cited the drivers for change in higher education as being the democratisation of knowledge and access, the contestability of markets and funding, digital technologies themselves and the impact that they're having, global mobility, and integration with industry. I'm pretty sure that most of those things are fairly consistent everywhere around the globe, that these things are impacting the way universities are doing their business. Now, are they having a meaningful transitional and transformational impact? I think that's yet to be seen. The affordability is pretty significant. When here in the US, I think it's now gone past $1.3 trillion of student debt. That's more than credit cards, more than what's occurring in the health system. It's a very large number. And the trouble is, as that number grows, the ability to actually bring back those funds into the system becomes less and less. So the ability of students to pay back that money is actually decreasing. So those numbers are growing in two dimensions. The same thing is happening in Australia. Obviously, we have a much smaller population, but I think we're in excess of $30 billion right now, which is actually the size of a fairly substantial global enterprise, if you think about it, and that's the size of the student debt. There are some other fascinating numbers that are associated with that. But if we move on from there, the student expectations of changing teaching and learning practice are pretty significant. They look at what they're doing in the rest of their daily lives, and they look at what they're doing within higher education system, and a lot of the time those two things don't match. And what they traditionally tend to do, as we've seen at the moment, is that they then tend to go outside of the system to actually get those experiences from elsewhere. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. but I think that what does need to happen is a refocus of either changing internally with inside the system or looking at how the system incorporates what happens outside into what's going on. I don't think there's an either-or answer. I think it actually becomes a blend of the two. We're seeing a lot of things occurring from the employer side, and I'm sure they're consistent with what happens here. When you talk to employers about graduates and what graduates are capable of, they will normally tell you that, that there is an unacceptable delay in time to productivity. That what students are able to do when they graduate is not consistent with what they need in their environments. Now, we know that there are individual variations on that, and we know that there are extremes. There are some employers that expect that the day that a new graduate presents on the job, they'll do everything in the way that corporate wants them to do, which is nonsensical, clearly. But there are a lot of things that they expect them to be able to do which fall into that category of transferable workplace skills. The things that help you outside of your discipline-specific knowledge, the things that help you perform in a workplace environment that actually are not being met right now. The picture of student debt in Australia is somewhat severe in certain instances. I think the fact that some students could rack up debts of $413,000 or $313,000, etc., and the likelihood of them repaying that is a failure of the system that something like that would actually occur. So they're obviously looking at certain aspects of that at the moment. So if you try to change the cost model in higher education, how do you do that? I did a bit of research and looked at some of these reference reports. This one is actually pretty good because it shows a view of all of the universities in the state of New South Wales. So it's a consistent view that says 30% of the cost is really academic employees and benefits associated with that. Roughly 30% of the cost is about non-academic employees within the institutions. So 60% more or less of the cost of education is in staff and human resources. If you change that, the question is what happens to the overall quality of the education? Are you still able to do the things that you want to do? So what I'm not advocating is saying, oh good, well let's just downsize by 50% and we're going to save an awful lot of money and therefore it becomes more affordable. That's not the answer. But I find it, when you think of the infrastructure that goes into institutions, it's really interesting that that's still a cost model that plays out. So I'm reminded of the project constraint model that says, you know, if you look at the functionality and features of something and the schedule to do something and the resources that you need to be able to do it, it forms a kind of what they call the iron triangle. And if you play around with these things, you find you can only ever have two of them. So there is a certain cost, time, whatever to do something. And if you play around with it, you might have something that's cheap, and you might achieve that, but your functionality is going to change or your schedule is going to change. So how you play around with this in terms of time, cost, and scope is going to have an impact on what your organisation is able to deliver over time. So what are the other choices? One of the other models that people are looking at is the whole idea of unbundling education. What that can do is shift the cost to a choice-based model. Not everybody needs all the same sets of services. If you look at what happens in an institution at the moment, you enrol in essentially what's a qualification bundle. All of this comes to you for the price of your tuition. You get your core curriculum, the provision of the courses and the content, the tutes, the pracs, all these other things, and the infrastructure of the institution itself. But it's come as a bundle, and that's what you pay for. The argument is that maybe what we should be moving towards is more of a choice-based model, which says maybe you don't enrol in all of that. Maybe you enrol in the pieces that you need. Maybe you work through the sorts of resources that you need, and it becomes something that you can choose based on individual need rather than one set model of it. So obviously there are problems when you look at that model and you think about, well, how do you budget for that? How do you look at how that plays out across an institution? It's a possibility, people are looking at it, but I think that we need to take a much bigger view of what happens in the educational space, and particularly in the funding space, because let's face it, when you look at education and training more broadly, it is all based on a human occupying seat time for a set period of time. That's the funding model. It's based on credit hours, which was never intended to be any kind of measure of learning, but that's what it's come out to be in a pseudo sense. So if we're able to move away from those kinds of models, we look at what are the pieces, what are the building blocks that will enable us to do that. We've done that from a different perspective when we look at it from the Deakin Digital view, and I'll elaborate on that a little bit more in a moment. At the same time as these sorts of things are occurring in the arguments about affordability, there's all sorts of other things happening in the competitive space. There are large consortia evolving, there are free education models, they're all aspiring for levels of validity in what they're doing. There's a strong focus on competency-based models as one of the approaches to it, and I think in some ways that may hold some value in being able to solve some of those problems. When you look across a large number of these things, these are the key characteristics that are put forward. They're focused on affordability, changing the cost model. They're focused on competency-based or outcomes-based models. They're focused on things that speak directly to what employers want in workplaces. They are prepared to offer recognition of experience and learning. There's very often a focus on partnerships because you can't create this kind of change if you try and do it on your own. There is a strong reliance on things like open education resources, open education initiatives, etc. And that really, it appeals mostly to what we'll call the non-consumers in the market. These are the people, typically at the postgraduate level, who will not come to university. Because normally when you find people who would engage at the postgraduate level, there are some who go school, 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 undergraduate education, get a bachelor's degree, go straight into a master's degree, and they've done their postgraduate level. That has certain other artefacts. In actual fact, I'm told by the people who know far better than I that that was never the model of, say, a master's degree. That a master's degree was always intended to be something that you would engage with a bit later to demonstrate mastery once you have a certain amount of experience and once you're able to really come back and demonstrate that you are equal to that particular task and at that particular level. So we've got a slightly disjointed view of this. Where do we go with it? There's another piece that emerges out of it, which is, Kale did a study recently that shows that if you're prepared to recognise the learning that occurs elsewhere, it actually leads to greater success and completion rates in the normal model of doing university. So I think what we're missing here, even if we change nothing else, this ability to be able to recognise learning that occurs elsewhere within this context will provide some useful improvements to the system. We often talk about openness and open education, open initiatives, and I think that there is a disjointed view about what that actually means. So I'll just go over a couple of points because I think it's useful and has some relevance to what we'll talk about shortly. So what do we mean by open? First of all, open does not necessarily mean free. They are not the same thing. It may be, but it also very well may not be, and we can show you good examples of all of those. Open means a different thing in different contexts. So if you talk about an open university, it doesn't mean the university is free, but it means that it's open in terms of your access to it. There are no barriers to your entry. You're making your own decision about your ability to participate. When you look at open education resources, they are free, and they should be open. They're not always, but they should be open. The idea of openness means that I can take that, I can reuse it, I can manipulate it, I can use it in my own environment. And normally it's just the licensing which determines whether I'm able to do that and make a profit out of doing that with the resources. There are plenty that will let you do that. There is always that base level of saying, if I take somebody else's work and I reuse it myself, I need to give them the recognition that I've done that. So that attribution only kind of license. I would argue from various respects that attribution only is probably the best form of open license that you can have. There are a number of other artefacts that occur when you try to do others. So what we're looking at here in our particular view of things from the Deakin Digital perspective is that we see the next big transition. The actual transformational piece is that shift from open education to open credentialing. And here we're using the idea of open in terms of no barriers to access. So you can come to Deakin Digital when we actually have it up and running. We're close to it now. And the model is that you can look at what we offer as credentials, and we're not going to say, oh, but you have to have done 15 other things before you can do this. It's a self-assessment, self-assertion model in the first instance that then goes through a validation process. So the self-assessment is, do I think I'm ready? The actual process of the credential is, do we think you've got what it takes? And we will use some very robust rubrics for doing that. We can talk a little bit more about that in a moment. An interesting anomaly with OER is that there is only one reason that OER exists, and that is for, if you like, the 4 R's of OER, the reuse, revise, remix and redistribute. What we find characteristically that there's only one R that is common, and that is the reuse in an adoption model. So if you've got something that I like, I can take that as it stands and I can reuse it in my environment. The evidence at the moment shows that not many people are doing the revise, remix and then redistributing based on that, which is very unfortunate. That's, to me, one of the greatest things that is holding back open education resources, because if you could do that easily, the potential would just explode. And the problem is that there is no, the formats are often incorrect and there's no simple tool to be able to do that. Fix that problem and OER is going to really take off very substantially. It also then speaks to one of the issues of the cost model. There's an awful lot of cost bound up in universities, which is about reproducing the same content over and over and over again, when in actual fact what we should be doing is looking at some of these more open models where we can take things, improve them, reuse them in our context, and then make them available to other people as well. It's a very beneficial way to work. Another piece that I'll just mention, so in dropping down these multiple threads before we tie them all together, the work around analytics and cognitive systems, we believe, has a very important role to play in where these things go into the future. I'm not going to, in a room of experts like this, not going to delve into the detail of analytics and cognitive systems, but I just want to point out a couple of things that I think are important. Big data models are very important to us, and they're useful, but they're still based on us thinking like a machine. So we have to program these machines to do things in a particular way, and we have to speak their language. When we look at a cognitive computing models, it's the opposite view. It's that the machine is beginning to speak like we do. We get into conversational models with machines. We begin to interrogate the information quite differently. We begin to open up different potential in terms of the way that we can work with them. Those are the only 2 points that I want to make about those things. We're looking deeply into some of the aspects that come along with doing different kinds of things with analytics, not specifically learning analytics, but other kinds of analytics in the broader scope of where we see our vision. And we're also looking at some of the aspects that become possible through engaging with cognitive systems. And they are different. So we actually need to bring the two together to make them work effectively. But the questions that arise out of that from a university side are things like, what does that mean for the student experiences? How does that change learning? What happens to research and how does it become different? And what are the different roles that emerge from that? We look at that as the subsidiary of a university, and we're looking at it particularly from that career view of where things are going. And we're asking similar questions, but they're slightly different based on our perspective. There are lots of simple things in which people can use various forms of analytics, and some of these are not big data views, but there are just interesting ways in looking at how things are changing. For instance, when a student is looking for where they might want to study, they can now go to, I'll make this a bit larger, somewhere like Stanford University on LinkedIn, and they can have their questions answered like, you know, where are these people classically live, where do they work, so what are the kinds of companies that they go and work at, what sorts of things are they doing. Now you can start comparing quite a range of institutions on that basis, and you will actually end up with quite a different view. So if we have a look at Melbourne University, for instance, what we're seeing is that there's an awful lot of people here, obviously much more Australia-centric. Where do they work? There's a lot more financial industries rather than technology industries, and the sorts of things that they're doing are distributed across, education, research, consulting, operations. So you can start to get a view of what happens when you attend a particular institution. Now, granted, it's probably a bit skewed because we're still talking about a fairly small sample size, but as the sample size grows, then we're going to start to see a very different view. And there is a suggestion that incoming students are actually doing things like this to understand what their potential is. If I want to work at Google, where should I go to school? Or if I want to work somewhere else, what should I do? What increases my chances, right? As a point of interest, you can't actually do that with the University of Texas. That alignment of alumni and where they are is not currently present on the LinkedIn site. Just saying. So if we look at where some of these things go, what's happening in the cognitive system space and cognitive and allied sorts of systems that are like that? We're seeing the stuff that's coming out of Cortana and Siri and Google now, and they're affording different kinds of capabilities to us to do different things. I'm not going to go into all of those at the moment because we want to get to part of what Deakin Digital is doing, but there are some links in here which relate to reviews of comparisons of what these different systems are doing and what they do well and what they don't do well. How to set up Google now so that it works for you. So the whole idea of the transition from to predictive models. So if you like, I like to call the transition that it's shifting from participatory systems, which we're used to in digital technologies, to anticipatory systems when you start to engage in this kind of technology. And it's a very interesting way of conceptualizing it. And also there's the work that IBM is doing, and what I characteristically like to do when I'm looking at these things is look at what's happening in health. I think health is a really nice indicator because there's often a lot more work going on in there. It seems to be high stakes, but the models that are played out in health are things that we can look at and then look at how do we transplant relevant pieces of that into what we're looking at in education and into the way that people actually work forward in their careers and their lives. I think there are some really useful examples. The key thing for me when it comes to cognitive systems is that rather than the machines replacing the humans, what we're moving to is a stage where actually the machines begin to participate in the conversation. We've probably all seen the rather nice publicity piece where one of the enterprises has actually allocated a seat on their board to a smart system. And that they engage with that. They will ask it questions related to where they're going with their corporate strategy, and they will actually pay attention to it. Nice media piece. But I think that what it does demonstrate is that conversation is beginning to occur in different ways. And I think that's the more meaningful piece. We're looking at that aspect of it fairly significantly in terms of where we understand what we want to go over the next few years. So that brings us, if all of that is sitting in the back of your mind at the moment, then what are we trying to do with Deakin Digital, and why are those things important to us? So we're premised upon these following things. That previously you used to have to go to university if you wanted to know things. It's no longer true. You can get that knowledge anywhere. You can get it from all sorts of different online sources. They have different levels of credibility, so you need to be able to be digitally literate in terms of the way that you actually analyse that. But you don't really need to go to university anymore to find out stuff that you want to know. One of the things that happens with digital disruption is that things that were previously monolithic become more granular. We can see that as a key trend that's occurred in things like music and in publishing, etc. And we believe that that's another transition that will occur within education. The monolithic view is a qualification as we currently know it. It takes you 4 years to get a degree. It takes you so many years to get a master's or whatever other higher degree you're looking for. That's the monolithic view. I would question whether that is still suitable in today's world, that the digital disruption will come from transitioning into a more granular view of how you achieve these things. The systemic pressures which we've gone through, affordability, scalability, the unmet demand, especially in emerging economies. UNESCO statistics recently have shown that you'd have to open a new university capable of handling 30,000 students every single day for the next 15 years to be able to soak up the unmet demand within the world. Clearly not going to happen. So if we are concerned about meeting that unmet demand from all kinds of different perspectives, not the least of which may be some kind of social responsibility, that we need to actually change what we're doing. Otherwise, we will not be able to make a meaningful impact. And also, as we outlined in the beginning, the need to shift away from credit hour models, which if you've read any of the reports and the discussions and research on this, was never intended to be a measure of learning in any way, but has become an approximator of it. So the challenge for higher education is that these things have become institutionalised across government, across policy, and higher education is actually significantly prevented from changing some of the things that it needs to change because it won't get its funding any other way. So it's not until we actually look at it from a macro systemic view that we can actually allow some of the transitions to take place within higher education that actually are going to lead to the change that we need more broadly. And a strong focus for us is this alignment with transferable workplace skills. So the question is, all very nice, but how have we actually done it? So we've actually taken a view that I describe as like turning the university on its head. We've taken exactly an opposite view. What you do in university is you do study units and you acquire competence or capabilities or skills or knowledge around particular areas. And you accumulate these things over a 4-year period, and at the end of that, you will have become suitable for the bachelor's degree in whatever it is that you've been studying. It's very popular particularly in the UK and other parts of Europe and in Australia. It has been more popular in the past, but I'm not seeing a lot of evidence of it at the moment, not as much evidence, of looking at a focus on what a graduate can actually do once they leave the institution. These are variously termed as graduate attributes or graduate learning outcomes. The terminology we use in Deakin University is graduate learning outcomes. That's the focus of what somebody is able to do. These things generally look fairly similar across many different institutions. There are some variations, but they're generally similar. At Deakin University, the graduate learning outcomes are communication, digital literacy, critical thinking, problem solving, self-management, teamwork, global citizenship, and then the discipline-specific knowledge. So the expectation is, as a graduate, you would demonstrate these characteristics at a particular level, and that's the commitment, if you like, that the university is making as you graduate. When you ask most universities, and how do we know, unfortunately the argument begins to break down a little bit because they have not tracked the accretion of these particular characteristics throughout their journey in the institution. Now, Deakin University, probably about 2 years ago, initiated a large piece of work which has led now to over 250 of the courses where you can actually identify that. On a unit-by-unit basis, this is where you have begun to accumulate these kinds of characteristics through the particular courses that you have done, which is a meaningful transition in terms of being able to say, yes, we can assert that our graduates have these particular attributes. From the Deakin Digital side, we've said, that's great, but we can't change the operational / business model / engagement with the workplace if we take that same particular view. So we've said, if that's what the graduates look like when they've finished, that's where we're starting. So our process has been to align with what's called the Australian Qualifications Framework. So Australia has done a lot of work which has said there are levels of attainment of particular kinds of characteristics. There's a 10-level scale that they've arrived at, and it describes, so anything under Level 4 is really what they all talk about in terms of vocational education and training. 5, 6 and 7. 7 is actually where you get your bachelor's degree, because we've condensed those things into 3-year programs rather than 4. 8 and 9 is where you do your postgraduate studies, which are graduate whatever, diploma, certificate, whatever, into level 9, which is a master's degree, and level 10 is where you do PhDs. So a very robust piece of work around a qualification framework, and we've used that as part of the piece that we align to. So what we've said basically is, if we take the graduate learning outcomes of the institution, we look at the alignment across this scale, we should be able to describe what somebody's able to do at a master's level if we align these two things, which is part of the work that we've done. From there, what we've done is a set of generic descriptors. Now, in reality, when we've done this, you can't simply say, I'm going to understand what AQF level 9 is, therefore what is equivalent to a master's degree. You actually have to do it across the entire range. Otherwise, you can't identify growth and dimensional change when you try to just look at one discretely. So we've had to map that out across the entire framework. We have also condensed it slightly into, in our purposes, we're using a 5-level scale rather than a 10-level scale, partly because it's going to be a long time before we deal with anything below level 5. Now, we've still described them, we've brought them into focus, but our core focus, given what we're doing, is at the higher levels. Significant for a number of perspectives. Now, I don't want to do that work every single time I want to look at a particular industry. So what I've done, that's why I've done these as generic descriptors across different dimensions, and then what I do is I customise it for a particular industry. And I do that by referring to industry-specific frameworks, and we've looked at everything from eSkills in the UK to particular frameworks like Skills Framework for the Information Age, which is now adopted in over 60 countries related to ICT. And what we do is we apply an assessment rubric around that says, to be equal to these particular learning outcomes at a particular level, aligned to this particular framework, these are the assessment things that we begin to look at. So our model is prior learning, assessment and recognition. The reality is, if we get this right and if we achieve the final alignment, which will have to be a process that goes through the university's academic board, it's not something that we can do, people will be able to accumulate these credentials, and ultimately, when they've got all of these credentials, they would be able to cash them in basically for a master's degree. Now, the implications of that are fairly significant. It means that I have two choices. When this is in operation, I can sit in either a virtual or physical classroom for 500 hours, do another 500 hours of work in my own time, and probably write 110,000 words in various forms of assignments to get my master's degree, and I actually haven't applied it within a work context. Or I can take what I've done in my work context, everything else that I've learned in all these different environments, whether it's certifications, courses, all these other kinds of things that have helped me learn, and to demonstrate these skills in a workplace environment. And if I can show the evidence of that, and we're very particular about the kind of evidence that we're looking for, then that would equate to the same thing. Actually, it doesn't equate to the same thing, because I know that if somebody has gone school, bachelor's degree, do a master's degree, all contiguously, and then they turn around and try to do one of my credentials, they won't get it. Because they don't have the experience, they don't have the application, they actually haven't demonstrated the mastery in a way that is meaningful to not only the individual, but to the employer and the employer side of things. So, we can unpack a little bit more the kinds of dimensions and things. I'm not sure how much interest this would be, but we are looking at portfolio evidence-based models. We are looking at psychometric testing in certain areas. If you look at something like global citizenship, it's broken down into component parts. So you can't just look at global citizenship and say, I can measure that. You can't. You can actually look at two dimensions, one of which is around cultural awareness and one of which is around ethics. You can measure those things, and sometimes it's very useful to use psychometric analysis to be able to determine whether somebody has achieved a particular level in doing that. So we haven't made it mandatory at this point in time for the psychometric piece to be built into the credential. Some of them we will, some of them we won't. It's going to be a bit flexible, but we know that there is an increasing reliance on the employer side when it comes to psychometric evaluation of potential candidates and to understand what it means for those people to be able to perform in the workplace. So we're building an association across the board in terms of what we're looking at in these spaces. Our target market for this, if you're dealing with prior learning assessment and recognition, you have to be working with people who have a fair chance of having acquired either prior learning or the experience that comes with that. So we're focusing on the non-consumers who are typically at the postgraduate level, which is why we've done a lot of work around focusing on that level 9 in the AQF. So they're adult learners. There's a possibility of some pre-university early entrant models, but that's very much later in our scope of things. International students who are unable or unwilling to travel, but may have acquired a significant amount of experience within their own environment. We're going to build and expand over time. So our model is very simple when we look at it from a business perspective. Low-hanging fruit is IT because they're used to doing it. The US Census Bureau did a study a couple of years back, which was only published earlier this year, that shows that 50 million people in the American workforce are selecting non-university forms of accreditation. 50 million. And they are also able to show that they have had a positive impact in the person's employability, in their career transitions. They're very meaningful things for them to do. So IT is very big in that space already. It's low-hanging fruit. The ecosystem is ready for this, and what we will do is engage strategically with them first. Once we've got that piece of work out of the way, we start to focus on expanding horizontally across different industry sectors and vertically in terms of how we progressively move down the scale. That will take us some years to do. But by the time that has occurred, we think that there will be a number of transitions within the higher education space that will change the way universities are currently doing their business. That might change faster than I can get there, and that's okay. I think that higher education is enormously valuable, but is not as easy to be a part of in our current society. When I talk about this particular model to various people, I never get pushback on it. What the people say is, you know, you're talking about me. I'm a senior manager. I have a family. I have to try and find time between my family and the work that I'm doing. I'm not going back to university for 2 years to do a master's degree. I can't afford the time. I probably can't afford the cost. I've got a mortgage. I've got all these other commitments that I have. Higher education has not reformatted itself to look at what the needs in the current marketplace are and has not been able to respond effectively to that demand. We believe that what we're doing here in Deakin Digital is a useful way of responding to that. We're working very hard to get it right. We hope we do. We're not doing it alone. There's obviously a lot of people that we're talking to and some fairly substantial organisations that we're looking at partnering with, and we think that they will help to keep us on track and keep us focused. But I think that basically tells the Deakin Digital story. And I'll finish with our vision, which is probably where most people normally start. But having told the story, this is what we're trying to do. We want to provide the most highly valued evidence-based employability credentials for continuous career development using smart systems. The provocative statement that I like to finish with, particularly when I'm talking in university spaces, is that in the medium term, I believe that credentials will become more important than qualifications. And the reason I believe that is because it's far better suited to managing your career in a lifelong mode, because what it does is it tackles that challenge of moving from something that's monolithic to something that's more granular. And you can reformat what you're doing in your career environment based on that kind of a model. It's very difficult to do it 3 years, 4 years or more at a time when you look at a qualification-driven model. I hope you found that a little bit interesting and a little bit informative, and if there are any questions, if we have any time for it. We're almost out of time. So.
Well, we started about 5 minutes late, so I think we've got about 10 minutes at least for questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right.
What's the difference between your model and continuing education?
The education bit. So probably what I didn't explain clearly enough is that we're not actually doing courses. I'm actually agnostic to how you learn something. I care very passionately whether you're actually able to demonstrate that you have that particular capability. So that's what I'm focused on. It's an assessment of capability, and capability is the word that I'm using, not competence. Competence tells us purely what you're able to do now. Capability tells us what you're able to do and how you're able to grow into the future. So we're a capability-focused model. Did that answer the question, or you can clarify if you like?
Persons who go for continuing education typically either recognize that they need to advance, or they already have some kind of degree and need to acquire more skills.
Yes.
And you seem to be hitting in the same domain.
It's in a very similar domain. The process and the fulfillment of the objectives is slightly different. If somebody does a self-assessment in our space and says, look, I want that credential which is in a particular discipline area, and the discipline-specific stuff is actually quite complex and difficult to manage. So let's take one that's a different kind of workplace skill. Let's take something like either collaboration or digital literacy or something like that. If the person does a self-assessment on that and says, actually, I don't think I quite make the grade on this, I need to do something else, they probably won't do it from us. We will refer them to a whole range of either open educational resources or what Deakin University has is 3 component parts. There's the university itself, which does the traditional university stuff. There's Deakin Prime, which does enterprise training and is a registered RTO. And there's Deakin Digital, which is doing the credentialing work. So I can refer these people to either the university or to Deakin Prime. We work together as a kind of a triangle of things that you can engage with. But I don't specifically do the teaching and learning piece. There are some other pieces which are related to how people will engage in career-based issues and some other collaborative engagement that they will have that's built into the model, but it's not specifically about course delivery, if you like.
We have many conversations before the talk, and I mean, we have obviously a lot of similar thinking in this process. When you showed this whole diagram, we discussed it a long time ago as well, about this whole model coming from different graduate packages to the process of teaching and now master's degree. One thing which is great, I think, that you've done in your case is that you're a separate entity, which basically does not have any more of this structure that we were what is actually here for me interesting to see, or what kind of thinking behind the process, how you define our position here, where you have all these connections and then to bring that the master's degree. So in your case, why did you make this also the master's degree? I suppose LB also does have a master's degree. Do you think that there will be some sort of complementarity of these entrance into the existing master's degree requirements? Would that also require some level of master's degree for this type of thing? What's the policy or, and then there's another thing there as well, which basically that kind of becomes really clear that who's doing what, whether it's part of Deakin Digital or whether it's part of the university. So what's your preference?
So there's a couple of interesting and slightly complex questions within that. The possibility of this to play out within a university is definitely there. It would really require a different approach from a university to be able to do this. If you like, the seeds of it are beginning within Deakin University itself in terms of mapping the graduate learning, the unit learning outcomes to individual units. So there are some of the building blocks in place for doing that. But you would actually, to fulfill the model, you would have to teach differently. Otherwise, you would not be able to fully engage in the overall approach. So I think that it is possible. It would be possible for the university to take all the work that we've done, which is a substantial piece of work at the moment in terms of the descriptors, the assessment guides, all of that sort of thing that is already in place, and to say, good, we'll take that, we'll use it in our environment. The model of university is still to actually impart the knowledge and the skills and the capabilities, whereas our model is to actually say, no, we're not doing that bit. We'll refer you to the university or to wherever else you might need to acquire those skills. What we're focused on is doing the credentialing piece, which is to determine whether you have those capabilities or not. So they're synergistic models. We'd love to see more of an articulation between university and what we're doing. Our current plan is that people will go from the university, graduate, and then we'd like to see them transition into Deakin Digital as part of their future way of moving forward, which becomes much more flexible and gives them a different kind of way of dealing with how they manage their careers, how they manage acquisition of the new kinds of skills for their career pathway. Having said that, I think that a lot of people don't actively do that. There are not a lot of pieces of capability out there which will give you a way of managing your career effectively. And so a lot of people, their career kind of happens to them rather than they're planning where they're going and what they want to do, seeing changes in the marketplace and looking at how they would respond to it and where they would go next. I think that's another important piece of this overall model is to help people to do that. Most of the RPL programs, making a distinction, the RPL programs are focused on somebody being able to articulate into a university program. That's what they're used for. And the key difference with this is we're not doing that. I don't want to channel people into the university. If they decide that because they have particular knowledge needs they need to go there, great. Personal decision, we're empowering their choice. But I think we've got to look at the different roles that are taking place and understand it in that context. And probably the only other thing is that we're much more meaningful at this point in time at the postgraduate level. We will do some other things later on that will make it more relevant at the undergraduate level, but there's a change of thinking that needs to take place and a change of operation that needs to take place before that will be useful. So the university is the logical place for people to go out of school. I think it would be useful if they reformatted part of what they're doing to actually incorporate some of the thinking here, but I have no influence on that.
One of the things that you mentioned as well right at the start is the cost structure of higher education. A big part of the cost is obviously human resources. How do you think those humans are going to feel? How do you start to, because part of what you're trying to do is shrink that portion of it from the overall education. You're putting a lot of effort onto, you can learn wherever. You mentioned you don't have to take a course with EPA, for example, to get recognized. What you're investing heavily in is a validated, trustworthy credentialing process, and that's the innovation that Deakin Digital is doing. The concept is something anywhere, self-learning to take that out, look at programs to athlete or Coursera or whatever else. So what's your anticipation of that? In a way, the university will hire.
It could be seen that way. I'm sure some people will. I can almost guarantee some people will see it that way. Whether it actually plays out that way or not, I'm not sure. So, for instance, because we're not doing the teaching and learning piece, if people need to actually learn something, let's say we're talking about information science and they want to get engaged in some stuff with big data, then it's probably quite logical that an opportunity would be to do a single unit enrolment within a university to be able to do that. The difference in the model is that rather than saying I'm going to enrol in an entire degree program, I'm going to pick the piece that I want and do that. So I think that model is going to shift. I think there's going to be a bit of tension between the two over time. I think that's inevitable. If we get our bit right, then I think that will happen. So I think the reality is universities, not because specifically of what we're doing, but I think that the writing is on the wall. Universities have to change. They have to become something different within the overall context to take a different role. We need the research. We need areas where people can go and specifically acquire knowledge that is probably at the leading edge, that is doing things differently. That all has to be there, but I think the way that it's offered, the way that it's presented to people, particularly at the postgraduate levels, no longer suits what we need. So I think there's going to be a lot of tension around that. I will unashamedly say that I hope that we have an impact on that. I hope the overall impact at the other end is very positive from all respects, because ultimately we as a society are going to win when the individuals are better educated and better able to perform within the context of broader society. So that's really what the end game is. We're just doing one little piece.
Well, obviously right now the threat isn't there because you specifically stated we're pursuing non-consumers, meaning that you're not challenging the existing educational marketplace, you're
Correct.
looking at those who aren't a part of it but could be and should be from it.
Correct, correct. If that has an impact on the current consumers, there's a message. and I think that that's a message that needs to be heard.
You're saying that there was maybe up to 50 million of those non-consumers that are looking for something, or something like that. You're looking at it potentially, if the colleges could meet their need, you're shifting some of those people who could be going into some of those college classes, pieces here and there. And that could be very attractive to
Absolutely.
colleges and
Yes.
to professors too. Is that, hey, if you're willing to adjust your model to accept these people who are around the world, who have difficult schedules, who have families, etc., we can get you a lot more people in here.
Yep.
So that can be very attractive in this comment.
And that's certainly a discussion we're having inside the university at the moment, because obviously when we talk about this, the question from the university side is, well, that's all very well, but what's in it for us? And we think that there is substantial growth to be gained out of accessing these people who are non-consumers for particular pieces of knowledge and skills and capability that they will not get from anywhere else. Absolutely.
It's a really appealing model for the university, right? Right now you graduate, you walk through class facilities, you finish on, you get around into leading alumni associations and membership, but we don't provide you those clear pathway, that PTO, that right at the end, a way to successfully manage your career. So now I don't have 30,000 for 4 years, I have 300,000 for 3 decades.
Yep.
Honestly, from a business standpoint, quite apart from the social, educational right thing to do, it's a very appealing future.
We believe so.
But there's another angle in that, like some universities, like Alaska University, has a model where they have transferable credit.
Yes.
So the students can come. Although we can see a lot from inside of the institution that the universities are not really so interested in doing that.
Yep.
Basically, it boils down to just to the credentialing, the assessment part. And I think the role that the Deacon provide, or organizations like Deacon provide, basically that spot where universities don't know really how to do that. Not that they don't know how to assess students, but that's not their primary mission. Their primary mission is teaching, learning, and educational experience.
Yes.
And where Deacon is basically filling that space.
Yeah, correct. Athabasca has a really, really solid track record in looking at those assessment models for prior recognition, and I think I'm looking forward to interacting a lot more with some of the Athabasca people around that. But I think that yes, we're talking about something that is significantly different.
Sorry, go ahead.
As Beacon Digital progresses, how well recognized do you feel credentials will actually be
Really good question. So if you're going to do something different, people have to have some frame of reference in terms of, is it worth doing? What's the value of this thing, right? So Deakin University has a reasonable reputation. It's in the top 3% of universities in the world. So when you look at that, when you look at the kinds of measures, and recently has climbed fairly substantially in its rankings. It's nowhere near some other universities, obviously, but it's in a good space. So a Deakin University degree, particularly in certain areas, we all know that universities are not uniformly the best place to do every particular qualification, that it varies across different places. The interest in this model, so I've done two things. First of all, aligning to something that people already have an understood value. So having a master's degree is something that people readily understand. The fact that we're aligning credentials to that level is useful. If we're successful in getting this through the academic board, and we've got a lot of support for it at the moment, we will have a test case of a particular discipline program that will take it through for a master's degree. If you then step back from that and say, well, how different is that? Well, in many ways, it's not that different. You can do a PhD by publication. You can do lots of different qualifications by drawing on different evidence and then doing capstones and all that kind of thing. So it's not as if we're doing something that is so radical that nobody's ever heard of it before. What we are doing is we're taking this into a model that actually formalises it in such a way that it takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. Probably that's a good way of understanding it. My model is in the short term to align to a qualification. My statement is that qualifications will be less valued than credentials. I firmly believe that. I say it in a lot of different places, and I haven't fully been challenged on that yet. I think a lot of people take a look at it and say, well, actually, I do get the value of that. If I were to change my career, do I have to go back and do a 18-month or 2-year master's program to be able to do something else? I would argue, no, you don't. You actually need to do the bits that will give you the bridge to get to where you want to go. So that's why we're talking about the granular being more useful than the monolithic. And that's why I think credentials ultimately will have a stronger role to play. That's not going to happen immediately. That's going to happen over a period of time. When that occurs, I'm no longer interested in whether my credentials align to a master's degree. I care about the credentials themselves. I care about the quality, the validity, the authenticity, the sufficiency of those credentials, but I don't necessarily care, and I don't think that the people who actually go out and get credentials will necessarily care whether it ends up in a master's degree. I think that they'll care about a bunch of other things.
Okay, well, we're a little bit over time here, but thanks very much, Allyn. I think, as I mentioned earlier on, this is some of the more innovative work that I see going on in higher education, and there's some really significant implications for this going forward, because at some level, as we see, as you know, the unbundling process, there has to be a rebundling, right? We can't have an unbundled system. It's that rebundling that'll be interesting, and I think we're starting to see a few organizations, Deakin Digital being among the leaders, that are thinking of what does a rebundled credentialing system look like that better addresses the needs of a learner rather than the needs of a system. So thanks very much for this informative overview.
Thank you.